Chapter 264. Every book teaches terror must be banned. At first, the Toronto court refused to accept the lawsuit of Dr. Ibtihal. According to the court, the Quran and the Hadiths of the Prophet of Islam were written 1400 years ago. Such a complaint would be accepted if the person who professed to have received them from God was still alive. Only when Dr. Ibtihal demanded that her last book should be released because it did not include terrorist teachings as the Quran and the words of the Prophet of Islam did the court accepted the lawsuit. The Islamic Council of Toronto refused to present legal representatives to defend the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad on the ground that as an individual body the council would not be able to represent Muslims all over the world. The trial was conducted anyway against an absent author. After the trial, the court ruled in the favor of Dr. Ibtihal. Regarding the verses of the Quran that the lawsuit included, they were considered by the court as anti-Semitic and the cause of the modern Islamic terrorism. Nevertheless, the court could not issue an order to place a ban on the Quran. It encouraged Muslim leaders in Toronto and all over Canada to avoid teaching their congregations and the young generation of Muslims such terrorist verses. The court left the question of the words of the Prophet undecided because the hadiths were disputed between the various schools of Islamic jurisprudence. Nonetheless, the court rejected the demand of Dr. Ibtihal to lift the ban order against her last book. The Islamic Council in Toronto considered the decision of the court as blasphemy and an unpardonable sin. According to the council, by condemning the sacred text of the Quran as the source of terrorism and anti-Semitism, the Toronto court hurt the religious sentiments of Muslims. Then, the Islamic Council requested the court to issue a public apology to Muslims all over the world. The Toronto court rejected the request of the Islamic Council and refused to issue any apology to any Islamic group. The trial outcome was a great disappointment for Dr. Ibtihal and the other directors of the Muslim liberation movement. Dr. Ibtihal expected that she would be able through the lawsuit to convince the court to place a ban on the Quran and the Hadiths because they included anti-Semitic and terrorist teachings. Although the court did not reject her lawsuit, still she felt the decision of the court was unfair. In the previous trial, the same court placed a ban on her book because it included one phrase that was considered anti-Islamic, while the Quran and Hadiths included many verses and sentences full of instigation to kill innocent people because they rejected the claim of Muhammad as prophet and refused to become Muslims. The court should have applied the same rule to place the Islamic texts on ban in Canada as it did to the book, Imagine a World Without Islam. However, the court made exemption and gave reasons that did not make sense to Dr. Ibtihal. The court could not condemn the Islamic texts and place them on ban in Canada because their author was no more. Dr. Ibtihal tried to convince the court by saying that if a book written 1400 years ago had in it anti-Semitic and terrorist teachings, that book should be placed under ban in order to protect the society from its dangerous instructions. The court rejected her request to issue an order to stop Muslims from possessing and teaching their religious texts in Canada. Nevertheless, Dr. Ibtihal refused to give up and decided to lodge a second complaint against Islam. This time she decided to direct her attack on the founder of the religion of Islam himself. She was basing her complaint on her own bitter experience of being an apostate in Sudan. She was tortured and abused in the Sudanese jail during her marriage and apostasy. Wherefore, she decided to lodge a complaint against the Prophet Muhammad and accuse him as a dangerous offender. Wikipedia wrote about this offence as, in Canada, England, and Wales, certain convicted persons might be designated as dangerous offenders and subject to a longer, or indefinite, term of imprisonment in order to protect the public. The purpose of the legislation is to detain offenders who are deemed too dangerous to be released into society because of their violent tendencies. Dr. Ibtihal believed that the Prophet Muhammad is a dangerous offender and hence he should be subjected to indefinite imprisonment in order to protect the society from his violent teachings. Since Muhammad was no more, Dr. Ibtihal believed that his teachings in the Quran and the Hadiths produce dangerous offenders who are called by various names such as Islamic terrorists, husband abusers, or religious leaders who teach their followers to carry out terrorist attacks against non-Muslims, in the name of holy war or jihad. According to Dr. Ibtihal, every Muslim who becomes a true Muslim and faithfully practices the teachings of the Quran and the Hadiths becomes a dangerous offender, and hence he would pose an imminent threat to society, and he should be designated as a dangerous offender and detained indefinitely. Dr. Ibtihal supported her lawsuit with her personal bitter experience in Sudan and the verses of the Quran and the Hadiths that teach violence. This time the court in Toronto refused to accept her complaint on the ground that she had already submitted a similar complaint and the court had already decided on it. Dr. Ibtihal tried to appeal the former decision of the court, but her appeal was turned down too. Following the advice of Dr. Kamal, Dr. Ibtihal decided to submit a lawsuit against the Prophet of Islam to the International Criminal Court, ICC, in Hague, Netherlands. The International Criminal Court, ICC, accepted complaints against individuals if they committed genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. Dr. Ibtihal believed that Muhammad was guilty of all those crimes. Even though, in her lawsuit she decided to concentrate on crimes against humanity. In order to make her lawsuit impressive, appealing, and convincing, Dr. Ibtihal employed a team of legal experts to formulate her case. It took the team 6 months to come up with a 225 pages report about the crimes against humanity that Muhammad and his immediate caliphs, Abu Bakr, Omar, Osman, and Ali committed against innocent people and neighboring countries. The legal team prepared a second report of 500 pages summarizing the crimes against humanity committed by the other Islamic caliphs known as Umayyads, Abbasids, Fatimids, and Ottomans. The Caliphate was the only form of governance that had full approval in the Sharia. Although the Caliphate was officially abolished in Turkey in 1924, the Islamic leaders in Muslim countries continued to commit crimes against humanity until today. The main objective of Al-Qaeda was to restore the Caliphate and reunite Muslims all over the world under one caliph. That final step has been taken by the Caliph Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who established today's Islamic Caliphate, which is known as ISIS. The legal team prepared a third report of 1,000 pages briefly describing the Islamic terrorist groups and the crimes that they committed against innocent people. The legal team supplied enough evidences to prove that the current Islamic terrorist groups based and justified their crimes against humanity on the teachings of the Quran and the Hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad. The lawsuit also accused Prophet Muhammad of other aggressive crimes he committed against individuals. First of all, he was accused as a child abuser, and for that the lawsuit referred to the case of his child wife Aisha bint Abu Bakr, whom he married at the age of 6 and sexually abused and raped her when she was 9. Secondly, the Prophet of Islam was accused of being a sexual offender, and for that the complaint referred to the case of his war captive, Safiya bint Huwaya, whom he raped on the same day he killed her husband and her people. Thirdly, the lawsuit accused the Prophet Muhammad of heartlessly murdering people who wrote verses of poetry criticizing his cruelty towards his enemies. The most notable example was the case of the old woman Gurfa, whom he tied to 2 camels and split her body into 2 halves. Fourth, the Prophet of Islam was accused of torturing people to death. The lawsuit quoted the example of the people whom the Prophet of Islam had their hands and feet cut off. Then he ordered nails, which were heated and passed over their eyes, and they were left in the Hara, i.e., rocky land in Medina. They asked for water, and nobody provided them with water till they died. The ICC rejected the lawsuit of Dr. Ibtihal against the Prophet of Islam on the grounds that the court would not accept complaints against dead people. In order for the ICC to accept the lawsuit, Dr. Ibtihal was advised by some legal representatives of the court to redirect the complaint against the Islamic texts that supported and justified terrorist activities in the world. Dr. Ibtihal followed the advice of the legal representatives of the ICC and requested her legal team to redraft the 3 reports to meet the conditions of the International Criminal Court. The legal team faced serious difficulties while it was redrafting the 3 reports. The Islamic texts, the Quran and the Hadiths, are inseparable from the character of the Prophet Muhammad. The beloved wife of the Prophet Muhammad, Aisha, when she was asked about her husband's character, said, "The Quran is his manners." In other words, Aisha said if anyone wants to know the moral behavior of her husband, he should read his Quran. In order to go around those difficulties, Dr. Ibtihal suggested a brilliant idea to the legal team. She proposed that the lawsuit should mention that every Muslim in the world is a replica of the character of Muhammad. The ultimate goal of every Muslim in the world is to become another Muhammad. The closer to the character of Muhammad the Muslim reaches, the more dangerous he becomes to society. Wherefore, the texts of Islam reproduced every now and then thousands of terrorists and dangerous offenders under the model of the Prophet of Islam. Keeping them in Guantanamo Bay detention camp or fighting them in Afghanistan and Iraq would not solve the problem. The Quran and the Hadiths cloned every now and then thousands of terrorists after the example of the Prophet Muhammad. In actual fact, every Muslim in the world wants to be another duplicate of Muhammad. The person who succeeds in imitating everything Muhammad said and did would become a new incarnation of him, as Osama bin Laden and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi did in our time. In the past, Tamer the Lame reached closer to the character of his evil prophet. Tamer the Lame had killed 20 million non-Muslims during his jihad wars while spreading Islam in Asia and Eastern Europe. He gained the title of the most evil man ever existed. The lawsuit also included a sub-complaint about Muslim women's abuse and oppression in Islam. The Quran allows the man to cheat on his wife by bringing a second woman besides her. The wife could not stop him from cheating on her because she would be considered going against the words of God. It also permits a husband to beat his wife if she disobeys him and also to rape if she refuses his advances. The Islamic texts forbade women from being presidents, religious leaders, bosses, judges, and lawyers. There are reports of Muslim wives being beaten by their husbands by the Quran on their heads in Western countries. There are reports of Muslim men having secretly more than 2 wives in Europe and America. There are hundreds of cases of female genital mutilation are happening all over Europe. The International Criminal Court accepted the lawsuit of the Muslims' liberation movement and appointed a date for the hearing. The ICC invited any Islamic group that is interested to present the counter-defense to the serious charges that the movement had brought against the Islamic texts. The Mufti of Egypt and the rector of the Al-Azhar Al-Sharif University is the first religious head to respond to the invitation of the ICC. Although many other religious countries and groups responded to the invitation, the ICC rejected all and is satisfied with the first response that was submitted by the Al-Azhar Al-Sharif University. Many Islamic religious figures in the Muslim world criticized the Mufti of Egypt for agreeing to engage his prestigious institute in the affairs of such an anti-Islamic movement. For some Muslim leaders, such a trial should be considered blasphemy against revealed heavenly books such as the Quran and the Hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad. The International Criminal Court is not like other courts. It has different rules and regulations that made it unique. The proceedings of the court are not open to the public. The public could access those proceedings in the website of the ICC after the trial is conducted and a decision was reached. Only the 2 disputing parties and their legal representatives are allowed inside the courtroom. Besides the local police, the court has its own police. The local police of Hague are not allowed inside the courtroom. Therefore, the Dutch police accompanied Dr. Ibtihal until the doorsteps of the ICC and retreated. Dr. Ibtihal entered the courtroom surrounded by 2 international policemen and 1 policewoman. She was directed to where her legal representatives were sitting. In the opposite direction, Dr. Ibtihal saw a group of people whom she recognized as Egyptians. From their long beards and Islamic clothes, she knew those were the legal representatives of the Al-Azhar Al-Sharif University. Then, Dr. Ibtihal saw a group of lawmen that she identified as the judge and his jury. As soon as she entered the courtroom, the trial proceedings began. The first group of lawyers allowed to speak were the 7 legal representatives of the Muslims' liberation movement. There was no individual spokesman for the group. While the 7 were sitting, they began to present the charges one after another. Each one was assigned a number of charges to deliver. As soon as the first speaker finished, the second took over. All those verses of the Quran and the Hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad which are marked as license for the Muslim mujahideen to invade a tribe or a country, slaughter its inhabitants if they refuse to embrace Islam, rape the women as right-hand possession, and possess their lands, women, children, wealth, and properties were pointed out. The legal representatives mentioned many verses of the Quran and hadiths of the Prophet of Islam, which are considered causes behind creating Islamic terrorism all over the world. After presenting the charges against the two main Islamic texts, the legal representatives read the three reports that covered the crimes committed against humanity during the Islamic caliphates. The first report covered the period of the Prophet Muhammad and his four successors, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. The second report covered the period of the main four succeeding Islamic caliphates of the Umayyads, Abbasids, Fatimids, and Ottomans. The third report covered the Islamic terrorist groups and the crimes that they committed against humanity. The legal team supplied enough evidences to prove that the current Islamic terrorist groups based and justified their crimes against humanity on the teachings of the Quran and the hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad. It took the legal representatives of the Muslims' liberation movement 4 hours to present the charges against the Quran and the hadiths of the Prophet of Islam. After that, the legal representatives of the Al-Azhar Al-Sharif University were invited to present their defense. The first legal representative began his defense by counter-attacking the Jewish and Christian religious texts of the Old Testament and the New Testament. The court forbade him from dragging the Bible to the trial. He was repeatedly reminded to stop talking about the Bible. Finally, when the court realized that the Egyptian legal representative was pig-headed and determined to talk about the religious texts of the Jews and Christians, he was disqualified and ordered to vacate the courtroom. The other 12 legal representatives of the Al-Azhar Al-Sharif University objected to the decision of the judge and demanded that their colleague be allowed to re-enter the courtroom and continue his defense. They threatened to withdraw and consider the court unfair if their demand was not fulfilled. The judge refused to yield to their threats and pressures and asked them to continue without the expelled lawyer. The 12 representatives of Al-Azhar Al-Sharif University conducted a quick private discussion in whispers. At the end of that discussion, 10 of them left the courtroom and 2 remained behind. Those 2 legal representatives tried desperately to convince the court that Islam was intended to be the religion of peace, love, and tolerance from the beginning, but the hostile tribes of Arabia at the time of the Prophet Muhammad in Medina compelled him to resort to a violent approach. Even so, the difficult question that those 2 lawyers could not answer satisfactorily was whether the Medinan verses, which taught violent approach, abrogated the Maccan verses, which taught peaceful approach. They admitted that some Maccan verses abrogated some Medinan verses. After the death of the Prophet Muhammad, no human being has the authority and power to reverse that order of abrogation. Moreover, they accepted the charges that the Quran and the Hadiths ordered the killing of those who rejected the message of the final and seal of the prophets, Muhammad. They also confessed that Muslim mujahideen are divinely and eternally ordered by God to invade other non-Muslim nations and convert them to Islam. According to them, this divine order would remain a universal duty and eternal obligation on all faithful followers of Islam. The ICC based its decision on the charges of the Muslims' liberation movement and the defense of the Al-Azhar Al-Sharif University. The decision of the court came in the favor of the Muslims' liberation movement. The International Court ruled that all the charges are valid. The Islamic religious texts of the Quran and the Hadiths included verses and sentences that order and encourage crimes against humanity. There was historical evidence to support the charges of the Muslims' liberation movement. The legal representatives of the Al-Azhar Al-Sharif University admitted that those verses and hadiths represent the final message of the Prophet of Islam and no one has the power to reverse the order or nullify it. Based on the proceedings of the trial, the ICC ruled that the Quran and the Hadiths are not appropriate religious texts, and hence the court encouraged every civilized nation and country to place those books on the prohibited list of dangerous writings. Muslims should be advised not to teach their children those dangerous writings. Those dangerous writings had high potentiality of producing religious terrorists and dangerous offenders. The decision of the International Criminal Court was met with violent reactions in Muslim countries. In the Western world, the decision was received with mixed responses. Some critics anticipated that the decision was going to take the world to the time of the Crusaders and the Dark Age in Europe. Some considered it inapplicable and that it might lead to the increase of the Islamic militants. Those critics prophesied that no country was going to follow the advice of the ICC. Few critics considered the decision to be a bold step that should be given a try by the civilized countries. In the Muslim world, Christians as usual were made to pay the price for the decision of the International Criminal Court. Muslims in the Middle East and some African and Asian countries reacted violently to the decision of the ICC and set many churches and Christian schools on fire. In some places, brutal pogroms were directed against Christians that led to the destruction of their homes, businesses, and religious centers. It was alleged that the Muslim cops and military soldiers participated in the attacks and allowed the rioters to rape and massacre the Christians. The Vatican was the first European country and religious institution to condemn the decision of the ICC and blamed the International Court for stirring up religious strife and hatred. The Pope delivered a brief speech in which he condemned the decision and considered Islam a compatible religion like any other major religion in the world. He further said that, Islam, like any major religion, has its good and bad side, dark and white history, and good and bad leaders and followers. The Pope concluded his speech by encouraging Christians and Muslims to disregard the decision of the ICC. He requested Muslims to treat their Christian fellow citizens as their brothers and sisters in humanity. The first country to welcome the decision of the International Criminal Court was Denmark. The government of Denmark promised to place those religious texts of Islam on the prohibited list of dangerous books. However, the government spokesman said the implementation of the ICC decision might not be enforced in the near future. Netherlands appreciated the bold step of the ICC and promised to enact the decision of the International Court in the future too. Other European countries preferred not to comment on the decision of the ICC. India was the first among the non-Muslim countries to condemn the decision, and considered it an unjustifiable attack and an infringement on the sanctity of the second major religion in the world. All South and Latin America countries preferred not to comment on the ICC decision. Likewise, all non-Muslim countries in Africa preferred not to comment on the decision. The United States of America said that the charges against the Islamic main texts and the decision of the International Court revealed that those Islamic books suffered from serious drawbacks and needed to be subjected to editing and revision. According to a spokeswoman of the White House, Muslim scholars should pay careful attention to the charges against their religious texts and work out a major reformation to their religion. Canada and Mexico preferred not to comment on the decision of the ICC. Australia was the third country to adopt the decision of the International Criminal Court. Nonetheless, the Australian government thought the implementation of the decision might not be done in the near future. Israel also welcomed the decision of the International Criminal Court. But, it considered it second to impossible to convince Muslim scholars and leaders to discard those verses and hadiths that encouraged violence and produced terrorist groups. Israel believed that if those verses and hadiths were removed from the Islamic main texts, the religion of Islam would collapse. All Muslim and Arab countries condemned the decision of the ICC. The Islamic Republic of Iran promised to pay $50 million for anyone who assassinate the accursed Sudanese apostate who dared to lodge a complaint against the beautiful religion of Islam.